side of the soul? Is this something in our brain? Is it something in a different dimension?
Best way that I can be fulfilled is if I care for you.
Welcome, everyone. Thank you all for being here. It is so nice to see all these new faces at the Academy of Life. And as you may or may not know, the Academy of Life is a place where people gather to talk about things they care about deeply, things that matter most that we didn't learn in school. And certainly the science of spirituality is nothing that we try to look at in school. And so that's why I'm so grateful to Dr. Srini and Dr. Anna to be here with us tonight to share with us what this means, the value of spirituality. Without further ado, Dr. Pillay will go first, and he'll take it from here. Welcome.
Thanks so much, Shirley, and thank you, everybody, for joining us in this conversation today on the science of spirituality. What I'm going to be doing is presenting initially a fairly sterile view of the magic of the human brain in order to try to describe ways in which I think we can actually develop the brain in order to develop what I would call spirituality. And so I think in order to start, it might actually make sense to think more broadly about what spirituality is. And I'd like to start with a quote by D.H. Lawrence, which I think is important because what Lawrence points out is that spirituality is essentially something that is beyond will. And to quote Lawrence, "I know that man cannot live by his own will alone. With his soul, he must search for the sources of power of life. It is life we want," end quote. And I think that's a curious way to start to think about about spirituality. And Carl Jaspers extends this definition by talking about spirituality not simply as beyond will, but beyond finiteness, that man has somehow not been satisfied by what is finite and somehow needs to seek what is in the field of what is infinite. I think a modern behaviorist perspective is that spirituality is essentially about that which is beyond perception, that perception in of itself is not a full way to understand the world. And when we think about modern constructions of spirituality, I think part of what we're talking about is the ability to transcend perception and what we come across in a day-to-day existence, to actually have a sense of purpose, to have a sense of meaning, to be able to have faith, to have some kind of harmonious interconnectedness, to have an integrative power, some kind of multidimensionality, and holistic being. And that's really a mouthful if you come to think about it. But I think essentially what it means is that what you see is not what you get. And that there's more to you than meets the eye. And the reason I'm framing it in that way is I think this conversation today is to a certain extent about what Anna and I are going to be talking about, but I think for me what would be most meaningful is if you could have some kind of reflection and start to think for yourself, why am I here, and what am I thinking about, and how am I going to change my life, and should I listen to any of this, and what's this going to do for me? So essentially, what I want you to be thinking about is there a deeper and more complex part of yourself that you can connect with, and are you making the time for this in your life? This is what I discussed in my most recent book, Tinker, Dabble, Doodle, Try, Unlock the Power of the Unfocused Mind, in which I describe some of the problems associated with focus, because we're all so obsessed with focus. And then also some of the ways in which we can begin to unfocus in our day-to-day lives. Now, focus is absolutely essential, so let's just get that out of the way. We need to focus in order to finish stuff. We need to focus in order to complete tasks, to reach our goals, and to have a deeper understanding of things. So I'm not against focus per se. But what I am against is focus fatigue as a way of living your life. Because I feel that in life, what we really need to do is to build unfocus into the day so that you can get to focus, unfocus, focus, unfocus, focus, unfocus, so that there are ways in which you are constantly replenishing your brain. And so you might ask, well, what do I have against focus? What's so bad about focus? And here are a couple of reasons for that. The first is that focus actually causes fatigue. A great study actually showed that they actually took two groups of people in which they had one group of people look at a video with intense focus and the other group of people look at it as normal. And then they gave them a moral dilemma. And what they found out was that the group that focused intensely couldn't care less. They didn't want to solve the moral dilemma. And then they gave them glucose, and after giving them glucose, they started to care again, which essentially demonstrated that focus in of itself can deplete the brain. The second thing is that focus actually leads you to tunnel vision. That even though you're focused on a particular issue, you have this tunnel vision, and this tunnel vision is problematic, as in the case of Anne Wang, who essentially developed the word processor, but was not paying attention to the advent of the PC, and as a result became bankrupt. Focus also makes you blind to the future, and as a result of that, you may not be aware that there are robots coming your way and that there are robots taking over jobs like journalism and middle managers and even doctors. And focus prevents you from seeing connections, such as Gillette Corporation, for example, who had a battery division, and they had an appliance division and a toothbrush division, yet they were not first to market with a battery-powered toothbrush because they didn't make connections amongst their different units. And finally, focus really does limit your sense of self. And if all we have to do is think of the masters of the Renaissance in order to try to understand how focus can limit us and prevent us from connecting with our multidimensionality. So what I'm saying eventually is that focus does allow us to connect with the roads in our brains, but it prevents us from being in the fields of our consciousness. And unfocus is extremely important, mostly because it's not just some kind of incidental thing. It's actually what the brain uses 20% of the available energy at rest, even though it occupies 2% of the body's volume. And effort adds on only another 5%. So when the brain's at rest, it's doing a lot of important things. Part of what it's doing is it's tilling the soil of the unconscious. And that's what we actually need to do. Now you might ask, what's the brain doing when you're at rest? Isn't it just doing nothing, vegging out? Well, it's not. It's putting puzzle pieces together. It's leading you to that eureka experience. It's allowing you to replenish yourself. It's unjumbling information. And it's also allowing you to access memories. So part of what we have to think about is how do we develop new mindsets so that we can get new results? And in terms of particular techniques, I'm just going to be briefly mentioning these things, and then Anna and I will get into some specifics and greater depth about these. The first is positive constructive daydreaming. Now, Jerome Singer studied this since the 1950s, and he found that daydreaming, slipping into a daydream is not helpful. It's not helpful to just be thinking about something negative over and over again. But positive constructive daydreaming can improve your creativity, improve your social connection. It allows for rehearsal and planning, and it also allows you to become unstuck from habit. And if you ask, well, how do I do this? The first thing is, we actually spend 46.9% of our days daydreaming anyway. So why not learn how to daydream effectively? And so one of the things you do is plan it, schedule a 15-minute interval, then you decide to do an undemanding task, like knitting or walking or gardening. What Singer found is that you have positive wishful imagery, like running through the park or lying on a yacht, and then you practice this. And so this is one way in which you can till the soil of the unconscious. The second thing is dabbling, which I think a lot of us are afraid of because we feel like this is going to make us into dilettantes. But the reality is that Einstein developed the theory of relativity by dabbling with the mathematical theories of Poincaré. And similarly, Picasso also discovered Cubism by dabbling in those same theories. And in fact, this is what inspired the painting of Le Demoiselle d'Avignon. So I think it's important for us to think about dabbling as something that can actually enrich our life experiences. The third thing is napping, and here are just two things to mention to you, which is that 5 to 15 minutes of napping can actually give you 1 to 3 hours of clarity. If you want creativity, you're going to need about 90 minutes, but the reality is that too much napping can actually place a stress on your heart. The fourth concept is doodling, which improves your memory by 29%. Then there's psychological Halloweenism based on a study that showed that if you want to be more creative, embodying the identity of an eccentric poet can actually allow you to become much more creative than embodying the identity of a rigid librarian. And this is just a way of becoming unfocused so that you can connect with this. And then the last two concepts are possibility thinking, which are about asking not how do I, as a 40 or 50-year-old woman or man, deal with life and still find an entrepreneurial life. You ask, how do the exceptions do what I need to do? What is possible, and what would make this more likely? And this is just to illustrate that in this study, these investigators gave people the same cream, and found that if people saw the label lidocaine and believed it was for pain relief, their brains actually the brain reward system was activated. Whereas if they thought it was capsaicin, which is the active ingredient of chili, they found that the brain's pain centers were actually activated. So what you believe does in fact matter. And just as a brief example, during my fellowship in South Africa, where I'm originally from, the way that I got to Harvard was I actually picked up the phone and decided to call up the head of Harvard to see how to get to Harvard. And that eventually led me to being there. So I'm happy to tell you more about that and how I got there. But I think that possibility thinking does count for a lot. And so for you, what I'm asking is, how can you get to your greatest possibility, and how can you optimize your self-esteem, SEO, self-esteem optimization, versus maintain it, which is simply lowering the bar so that you can feel happier? Is there a way in which you can think of pressure as a privilege? And then finally, in terms of ingenuity, I strongly believe that this is a hugely ignored aspect of human nature. And just to mention that in terms of thinking about this, I think that instructions are one way of understanding things and going through things, but that the inner voice is what we actually need to listen to. And a classic example of this is the one laptop per child project, where people dropped laptops in rural Ethiopia, wondering whether the kids would sit on them, eat them, or do something weird with them. And what they found was that within 4 minutes, they found the on-off switch. Within 5 days, they started to use apps. Within 2 weeks, they were singing ABC songs. And within 5 months, they had hacked into Android. And this all without a computer science degree, which indicates that there's some kind of inherent intelligence that we are not accessing on a day-to-day basis. So my conclusion from this then is to give you a sense of why I wrote this book and why I wanted to let people know is that even though we avoid being unfocused, which I think from Kierkegaard's perspective is because we are actually afraid of freedom. We're afraid of floating in space because we want gravity and we want balls and chains, and it's this paradox that actually engages us. We need to actually consider this and consider that we can develop this in more than just esoteric ways. We can actually engage in positive, constructive daydreaming, in dabbling, in napping, in doodling, in psychological Halloweenism, in possibility thinking, and in ingenuity in order to reach our goals. And just to complete this, just this quote by Steve Jobs, I think captures what I want to communicate, which is, your time is limited, so don't waste it living someone else's life. Don't be trapped by dogma, which is living with the results of other people's thinking. Don't let the noise of others' opinions drown out your own inner voice. And most important, have the courage to follow your heart and intuition. They somehow already know what you truly want to become. Everything else is secondary. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Srini, for a wonderful talk. So I'm Anna Yusim, and as soon as Srini gets my talk up, I'll be telling you a little bit about my experience with the science of spirituality. Thank you, Srini. And I'm going to tell you about a few cases in my own psychiatry practice of how this has come to play and how I've integrated this in expected and unexpected ways. In many ways, the science of spirituality is a paradox, and Srini has touched on this. Science, by its nature, is subject to experimentation, empirical, observable, something that you can observe and experience with your senses. Now, this is very different from spirituality, which so often is immanent and transcendent and personal and subjective and difficult to replicate. So very much in many ways the opposite of science, which is why it has been so difficult to study spirituality scientifically and why it's not often used in many medical programs or in many modes of healing. So what is spirituality? Basically, it's a universal dimension of the human experience. It could be something that's deeply personal and internal. You know, a lot of people say we all have a divine soul, and that whatever you believe to be something greater than yourself, be it God or the universe, is actually within every one of us. Then it could also be experienced as something that is transcendent and beyond the self and external. It's experienced often as being of fundamental importance and concerns questions of values, meaning, and purpose in life. And spirituality and religion are very different. Religion certainly, for many people, is a mode of spirituality, but So is connecting to other people, being interconnected in a very deep way. So is meditation. So is connecting to the light. So my definition of spirituality is really being able to connect to part of something greater. And in doing so, in my book, I focus on 3 particular concepts. And the cases that I'm going to talk to you about illustrate these concepts in different ways. These concepts are synchronicity, interconnectedness, and immortality. So just briefly to give you a summary of these, synchronicity is a term that Carl Jung created to describe the meaningful coincidences of our life. It's, for instance, when you think about someone and then they call you right away. Or you haven't heard from someone in ages and you have a dream about that person and suddenly you bump into them on the street the next day, right? So one thing didn't cause the other. You're thinking about someone didn't cause them to call, but nevertheless, these 2 things occurred and you made meaning of them in your mind. You connected them. So this is the meaningful coincidence. Interconnectedness is the way in which we are all connected as matter, as energy, and this could be in a very practical way, how we all depend on each other and on the roles that we all have in society to function, but also in a quantum physics way, the fact that we're all energy and matter, and actually we're all one in many ways. And then immortality. So the way that I describe immortality here is the idea of a transcendent soul, that even after people pass, they are still with you in some way, shape, or form and can be a source of guidance and communication for you, even in this life. This is the case of Hans the violinist. At the time that this particular situation that I'm going to tell you about occurred, I'd been working with Hans for about 5 years. And I, at the time, went on a trip to the Ukraine. It was a 2-week-long trip. This was halfway through the trip. One night, I went to bed and completely not knowing why, I woke up with a start, feeling something is very, very wrong. Patients to me have described this idea of a midnight panic attack. Not being somebody who gets panic attacks, or certainly a midnight panic attack, I'd never had this before, and I was just completely overwhelmed. Something felt so wrong, and I had no idea what it was. So I felt compelled to check my email, and 1 minute prior, at the exact moment that I woke up, my patient Hans had emailed me that he was feeling suicidal. So somehow 5,000 miles away and 7 time zones away, I got this message, woke up from sleep, and was able to call Hans and talk him through what he was feeling. So what if I hadn't woken up? Maybe it would have been fine, or maybe it wouldn't. We don't know because that's not what happened. But still, this experience was so meaningful both to myself and to Hans that this happened, and what is the meaning? So this, in a way, is an example of synchronicity. These 2 things happen. Did Hans sending this email cause me to wake up? Who knows? Or were we somehow connected? So Freud believed in this concept of thought transference, which is really akin to telepathy. And it's when people are able to communicate outside the normal channels, which could be through anything. Sometimes you could be sitting with somebody and you just are able to read them. You have this intuitive sense of what's going on. And sometimes things happen that are much more profound and dramatic, like what happened with Hans. That case illustrates interconnectedness and also synchronicity. Another case of the same kind of idea. This is a man that I was treating for 6 months at the time that this happened. His name was Mark, and he was a priest. Actually, he wasn't a priest, but all the cases are disguised, and so this is from my book. And so for the sake of this conversation, he was a priest. Mark had said something to me like, it's really difficult to come to therapy and really talk about the things that most pain you and the things that make you feel vulnerable and that could make you feel ashamed or embarrassed. And I responded to him saying something like empathizing, and I understand how you feel, Mark, and sometimes you might want therapy to be like a massage where you leave feeling relaxed and that you feel relieved, but usually it's the most difficult things that you bring in here that actually have the most benefit for you down the road. I said something to that effect. Not a strange response, but talking to a priest about a massage, like, why would I say that? And as soon as I said that, I was like, why did I say that? And I couldn't take the words back, so I just kind of sat there and looked at him. And then as soon as I said that, his jaw dropped. And that's when he told me that actually the real reason he'd come to see me is because he'd been going to massage parlors, and he felt so ashamed about this. And so this thing that came out of my mouth unexpectedly that I still don't know how it came out, it ended up creating a big breakthrough in the treatment. So this was also, how do you explain this? Something was being picked up, something was communicated. It was almost like his unconscious was communicating to my unconscious. I picked something up and this strange thing came out. But it was so far outside of my conscious awareness because I never would have said that to a patient, certainly not to a priest or to a priest-like person. There's a woman, she's now passed away, she's a psychologist who is very interested in these sorts of things, these kinds of messages that we receive from one another, and the unconscious communications, Elizabeth Lane Mayer. She said, we cannot reach these new sources of information simply by tuning in to something new. Paradoxically, we must also tune out much of the ordinary information that continually bombards our senses. So this goes in line very much with what Srini was saying about the unfocused mind. So much of our life is very goal-directed, deliberate, conscious, willful. And then there's this other part of when things can come out of our mouth that we don't expect, when we can have an intuition or a breakthrough or an inspiration or a creative moment that doesn't really come from our consciousness. It comes from something deeper, whether it be from our soul, from our unconscious mind, from the collective unconscious, tapping into the field. Whatever that is, it's something that conscious and deliberate intent doesn't often open itself up to. And it's precisely by unfocusing that you can really tap into that part of yourself. So the next three cases I described, they're very, very similar. And this is having to do with the third thing on my list, which is immortality. So in each of these cases, oftentimes a patient will come to me who is bereaved, who's had somebody very dear to them pass away. And on one case, the boyfriend of a woman with whom I've been working, not the boyfriend, I was working with the woman, but the boyfriend committed suicide. And my patient was just beside herself and so understandably depressed. He was struggling with bipolar. They both fought it together, and they lost the fight, sadly. So she came in, and it was the second session after he'd passed away. And we started talking about it and talking about how she's been feeling about this, processing this grief. And suddenly, the door buzzer falls off my wall. And it was, just a little thing, like the buzzer just fell. And if my buzzer fell off my wall on a regular basis, it wouldn't really be meaningful to me or to my patient. But never before or since had my buzzer fallen off my wall. So the fact that this happened right when we were talking about the deceased girlfriend of, actually, it was also a disguise case. I said, sorry about that. I'm mixing up the disguises. In the book, it was actually, yeah. The reality was the patient was a male and it was a female who committed suicide. That was the reality. In the book, it was a reverse case. So the bottom line, when we were talking about the deceased person, the fact that this happened then, it was just still so meaningful to both of us. And we both started to wonder, is she here with us? And somehow that happening also was a turning point in the treatment and enabled him to know that even though she'd passed, she was still there. She was somehow present. She was somehow able to give him some solace. And that actually helped a lot with his bereavement process. This case happened right after I wrote my book. This man read the book and came to see me. And his mom had just passed away the week prior. And we're talking and we're sitting there, and suddenly the mirror falls off my wall. And both of us were, and at this point, I feel like this wasn't like the second time this has happened. Probably these things have happened maybe 4 or 5 times, and this is over the course of 10 years. So it doesn't happen that often, but it does happen. And so as soon as that happened, we both look, and I was like, well, I think your mom's here with us. I think she wants to say something. I think she wants to, And so we kind of used that in the therapy, and that helped his process, I feel, so much, because if you see that this person who you think is forever gone is there with you, that means you can tap into that. You can talk to them. You can communicate with them. They're not just there in my room. They're actually there with you at all times in some way, shape, or form. So that idea, I think, gave him a lot of solace. And the final example is actually of my friend Jonathan. It's a slightly different example. It was the moment his father passed away. He was playing cards with his buddies. And the moment his father passed away, he looked up from the cards. His father was not sick. He'd seen his father the day prior. And he said to his friend, my father just died. Jonathan knew the exact moment his father passed away. And he had no reason to suspect he was sick. There was nothing that could predict this, but he knew the exact moment. And people describe these things a lot. Like now, kind of having written this in the book, people are like, oh yes, this has happened. I know someone to whom this has happened. But the reason, to me, this is interesting, and probably to Srini, because it's so outside of our traditional medical training. As doctors, as scientists, you don't really learn about telepathy and thought transference and immortality and these sorts of ideas. They're very, spiritual and not scientific. And so, in terms of the immortality idea, it really has led me to believe and to ask. This is a quote by Pierre Teilhard de Chardin. And he says that we are not human beings having a spiritual experience. Perhaps we're spiritual beings having this temporary human experience. It actually takes the paradigm and turns it on its head, which is so, so powerful. And so what are the implications of this? One of them is that we are much more complex and multifaceted as human beings than the scientific model would lead us to believe. And that science often isn't an adequate tool. It's certainly one of many tools, but it's not alone an adequate tool for understanding all of the human experience. And as Srini and I were talking, in which we'll talk about some more, art often can present, and spirituality can be two other tools through which the human mind and construct and the human experience could be more thoroughly understood. And one of the things with all this is the evolutionary change that we're currently undergoing as we're welcoming in concepts like interconnectedness, synchronicity, elevated consciousness, is a shift, an evolutionary shift from power being localized outside of ourselves to power being localized within ourselves. So a shift from external to authentic power. External power is when we try to control other people, when we try to control our external environment. It's about domination, it's about force, it's about violence, it's about destruction. It's about trying to manipulate things externally, basically, in all the different ways that we know how. And this is very different from authentic or internal power, which is about connecting with your soul and tapping into your intuition and relinquishing any victim mentality, really taking responsibility for your life and ultimately starting to practice faith, forgiveness, and living the life that you have come here to live. Srini and I will now have a little discussion, and then we very much welcome your questions. Thank you.